Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back, my daughter-in-law said, her voice as calm as if she were asking me to pass the salt, and my son, my own son, just sat there, smiled, and nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, like 32 years of marriage, of raising him, of building that home together meant absolutely nothing. And for a moment I thought I hadn't heard her correctly, because the dining room still smelled like the rosemary. Chicken I had cooked that afternoon, the same recipe my husband used to love, and the table was still set with the good china I only brought out for family dinners, the kind where you expect warmth, laughter, maybe even a little healing after a loss. But instead there was only silence stretching across the table, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint clink of my son's fork against his plate, as if he couldn't even be bothered to look up at me while his wife erased me from the life I had built. And I remember noticing the smallest things in that moment. The way the overhead light flickered slightly, the way the chair across from me, my husband's chair, remained empty, still carrying the ghost of his presence, and how just a week ago I had stood beside his grave believing that no pain could be worse than losing him. But I was wrong, because this quiet dismissal, this calculated indifference, cut far deeper than grief ever could. And I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise my voice, because something inside me went completely still, like a lake freezing over in the middle of winter, and I realized that anything I said in that moment would only give them what they wanted, a reaction, a scene, something to justify what they were doing. So instead I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate, pushed my chair back without a sound, and stood up, my hands steady, even though my heart felt like it had been hollowed out. And I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time that evening, searching for even the smallest trace of the boy who used to run into my arms after school. But all I saw was a man who couldn't meet my eyes, a man who had already chosen his side long before that dinner began. And that was the moment I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit, that I had been losing my place in this family long before my husband passed away, that this wasn't sudden, it was simply the first time they had said it out loud, and I nodded once, not to agree, but to acknowledge the truth of what had just happened, and then I turned and walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving behind the house I had once called home, leaving behind the people I had once called mine. And as I stepped into the cool evening air, the door closing softly behind me, I heard Jessica's voice again, lighter now, almost relieved, already talking about something else, as if I had never been there at all. And that was when I knew, with a clarity sharper than anything I had ever felt before, that they believed I had nothing left, that I was just an old woman with nowhere to go, nothing to stand on, and no way to fight back, and they were very, very wrong. I did not go far that night, just 3 blocks down the street to the small bus stop near the corner where the old oak tree leaned slightly over the sidewalk. The same stop I used years ago before Daniel bought me a car for my 65th birthday, back when he still noticed the little things that made my life easier. And I remember sitting down on that cold metal bench, the chill seeping through my coat as the evening air settled around me. And for the first time since the dinner I allowed myself to breathe, not deeply, not with relief, but just enough to steady the quiet storm inside my chest. Because it was not the kind of pain that makes you cry, it was the kind that makes everything go silent, like the world has been muted and you are the only one left hearing the echo of what just happened. And I watched as a car drove past, then another, headlights stretching across the pavement in long white lines. And I thought about how strange it was that life outside that house kept moving so normally while mine had just been erased in a matter of minutes. And I replayed the dinner in my mind, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them, the way Jessica had not even hesitated, the way Daniel had not even tried to stop her. And that was when the memories started to rearrange themselves, small moments I had ignored before suddenly falling into place with uncomfortable clarity, like the time Jessica insisted on handling all the household bills after my husband got sick, saying it would be easier for everyone, or the way Daniel stopped asking me about decisions that used to involve me, from repairs around the house to holiday plans, or the quiet afternoon when I found my husband's study door locked for the first time in 30 years and Jessica casually told me Daniel had changed the code for security reasons, and I had accepted all of it without question because I believed that was what families did. They adapted, they made room for each other, they trusted, But sitting there under that dim streetlight, I realized something I had not wanted to admit before, that those changes were not adjustments. They were steps, careful and deliberate, leading to exactly what had happened tonight. And I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar beneath the heaviness. Not anger, not yet, but awareness, sharp and precise. And it settled into me slowly as I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up my hands in the dark, showing no missed calls, no messages, no attempt from Daniel to check if I had made it somewhere safely. And that silence told me more than anything he could have said. And I slipped the phone back into my purse, straightened my coat, and looked down the road just as the distant headlights of a bus came into view, its low hum growing louder as it approached. And as it pulled up in front of me with a soft hiss of brakes, I stood, steady now, more steady than I had been all evening, because something inside me had shifted in a way I could not yet fully explain. But I understood one thing with absolute certainty as I stepped onto that bus and reached for the handrail. I was not going to beg for a place in a life where I had already been dismissed, and whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms, not theirs. The bus was nearly empty when I stepped inside. Just a man in a construction jacket sitting near the back and a young woman scrolling through her phone by the window, neither of them looking up as I dropped a few crumpled bills into the fare box and made my way to a seat halfway down the aisle, the engine vibrating softly beneath my feet as the doors closed behind me with a quiet finality that felt heavier than it should have. And I sat by the window, watching the streetlights blur into long golden streaks as the bus pulled away from the curb, carrying me farther from the house that had once held every version of my life. And I rested my hands in my lap, noticing how steady they were now, how the trembling from earlier had faded into something else entirely, something calmer, more deliberate. And as the bus moved through familiar streets that suddenly felt distant, I found myself thinking not about where I was going, but about where everything had started to change. Because it had not been tonight, it had not even been after my husband passed. It had begun long before that, in quiet ways that were easy to overlook at the time. Like the evening Jessica had laughed lightly when I suggested hosting Thanksgiving at the house, and said it might be easier to do something smaller at their place instead, or the way Daniel had started calling less frequently, his conversations shorter, more distracted, as if he were always in the middle of something more important. And I had told myself that was just how life worked, that children grew up and built their own routines, their own priorities, and mothers learned to step back. But now, sitting there under the dim interior lights of that bus, I saw it differently. I saw how each small shift had created space, and how that space had slowly been filled with decisions that no longer included me. And I remembered the afternoon Jessica offered to organize the household paperwork after my husband's health began to decline, her tone so helpful, so reasonable, and I had been grateful, relieved even, because it meant one less thing to worry about. And I had signed where she told me to sign, nodded when she explained things in quick, confident sentences, trusting that it was all being handled with care, because why would I not trust my own family? And then there was the moment when Daniel changed the locks on the back door without mentioning it to me first, brushing it off as a simple safety measure. And I had laughed it away, not wanting to seem suspicious or ungrateful. But now those memories no longer felt harmless. They felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was assembling. And I turned my gaze to the reflection in the window, my face faintly visible against the dark glass, older than I remembered, but not fragile, not as helpless as they seemed to believe. And the realization settled into me slowly but firmly, that I had not been pushed out in a single moment. I had been moved aside step by step until there was no space left for me at all, and the bus continued forward, steady and unhurried. And as it did, I felt something shift inside me again, not a surge of emotion, not a sudden decision, but a quiet understanding that whatever had been taken from me that night was not everything. Because there were still things I did not know, things I had never questioned, and for the first time, I began to wonder if perhaps there was more beneath the surface than I had ever been allowed to see. And as that thought settled into place, clear and unshakable, I lifted my chin slightly and kept watching the road ahead, no longer as someone being carried away, but as someone beginning to pay attention. The bus ride ended 20 minutes later at a quiet intersection near the edge of downtown, a place I had not visited in years, and when I stepped off onto the sidewalk the night air felt sharper, cooler, as if it were trying to wake me up completely, and I stood there for a moment with my purse held close against my side, listening to the sound of the bus pulling away behind me, its fading engine leaving behind a silence that felt almost deliberate, and I realized I had not actually decided where I was going, only that I was not going back, and that thought did not frighten me the way I might have expected it to. Instead, it felt strangely steady, like standing on unfamiliar ground that was still solid beneath my feet, and I began to walk without rushing, my shoes tapping softly against the pavement as I passed closed storefronts and darkened windows that reflected pieces of my movement back at me. And with each step my mind returned not to the dinner, not even to Daniel or Jessica, but to my husband, to the quiet way he used to observe things without saying too much, the way he would pause before answering a question, as if he were always considering something deeper beneath the surface. And I remembered a conversation from a few months before he passed, one that had seemed insignificant at the time, when he had sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread neatly in front of him, asking me to sign a few documents while explaining that it was just routine, just updates, nothing I needed to worry about. And I had trusted him completely, not because I understood the details, but because I understood him, because for more than 3 decades he had never given me a reason not to, and now, walking alone under the dim glow of streetlights, I found myself thinking about those papers again, about the careful way he had organized everything, about the quiet insistence that it all be handled properly, and something about that memory felt different now, heavier, more intentional, as if there had been a purpose behind it that I had not questioned at the time, and I slowed my steps slightly as I reached a crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change while a car passed in front of me, its headlights briefly illuminating the road ahead, and I realized that my husband had always been meticulous when it came to finances, more than most people, keeping records, double-checking accounts, making notes in margins that only he seemed to understand, and I had always let him manage those things because he preferred it that way, because he said it was easier if one person kept track of everything, and I had agreed without hesitation, content to focus on the parts of our life that felt more immediate, more visible. But now, standing there with the faint hum of traffic in the distance, I began to wonder what exactly he had been keeping track of, and more importantly, what he might have been preparing for, and the thought did not come with panic or fear, it came with a quiet curiosity, steady and persistent, like a door that had always been closed but was now slightly ajar. And when the light changed, I crossed the street slowly, my pace measured, my mind clearer than it had been all evening. Because for the first time since I walked out of that house, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I might not have known all along. And as that realization settled into me fully, I understood that the story they believed was overhead only, just begun to reveal itself. And this time I was going to pay attention to every detail. There was a small 24-hour cafe across the street with a flickering neon sign that read open, and without thinking too much about it, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the soft chime above the entrance marking my arrival in a way that felt almost grounding, like I had crossed from one version of my life into another, and the warmth inside wrapped around me immediately, carrying the familiar scent of coffee and something sweet baking in the back, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting the quiet hum of the place settle into me, the low murmur of a radio behind the counter, the gentle clink of ceramic cups, the ordinary rhythm of people who had no idea that my entire world had shifted just an hour earlier. And I moved toward a booth near the window, sliding into the seat slowly as if I were testing whether I still belonged anywhere at all, and a waitress with tired but kind eyes approached, asking if I wanted anything, and I heard myself say coffee, black, the same way my husband used to take it. And when she nodded and walked away, I placed my purse carefully on the table and rested my hands around it, steady again. Always steady now, as if something inside me had decided that unsteadiness was no longer an option, and I sat there watching the street through the glass, the occasional car passing by, the reflection of the neon sign casting a faint red glow across the pavement, and my thoughts returned once more to that stack of papers from months ago, to the quiet way my husband had guided me through them, and I tried to remember the details I had overlooked at the time, the names of accounts, the tone of his voice, the way he had paused just slightly before handing me the pen, and I realized that it had not felt rushed, not careless, but deliberate, almost protective, and that realization settled deeper as the waitress returned and placed the coffee in front of me, the steam rising gently into the air, and I wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers as I took a small sip, letting the bitterness ground me further in the present. And it was in that quiet moment that another memory surfaced, clearer than the others, sharper, from just a few weeks before he passed, when he had looked at me across the kitchen table and said, almost casually, that if anything ever happened, I should not worry about anything, that everything had been taken care of, and I had smiled at the time, brushing it off as something people say when they are trying to comfort the ones they love. But now, those words felt different, not like comfort, but like instruction, and I set the cup down slowly, my mind beginning to connect things I had never tried to connect before, because if everything had been taken care of, then what exactly had been taken care of, and for whom, and why had I never been told more? And I reached into my purse then, not with hesitation, but with intention, pulling out the small leather folder where I kept the few documents I had thought were important, and I opened it. On the table in front of me, flipping through the papers one by one under the soft cafe lighting, and there, tucked between insurance forms and old receipts, was a folded page I did not remember placing there, thicker than the others, more formal, and I stared at it for a moment before unfolding it carefully, my eyes moving across the printed lines, not fully understanding everything yet, but recognizing enough to feel that quiet, steady shift inside me grow stronger, because whatever my husband had done, whatever he had arranged, it had not been simple, and it had not been careless. And as I sat there in that small cafe, the world outside continuing as if nothing had changed, I realized that I was no longer just a woman who had been asked to leave. I was someone who had just begun to understand that the story I had been told about my place in that house might not have been the truth at all. I did not rush as I read the document. I let my eyes move slowly across each line, each word settling into place with a clarity that felt almost deliberate. And even though I did not understand every piece of legal language, I understood enough to realize that this was not just another routine paper. It was something structured, something intentional, something my husband had taken the time to put together carefully. And I noticed my name printed in full, Margaret Whitmore, not alongside Daniel's, not under anyone else's authority, but standing alone. And that detail alone made my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the page, not from fear, but from recognition, because that had never been how things were presented to me before, not in our household, not in the way finances had been discussed. And I continued reading, slower now, more attentive, picking out phrases that began to form a pattern, references to accounts, to transfers, to designated ownership, and then a word that stood out clearly even among the dense text, trust, and I paused there, my eyes lingering on it as if it had been waiting for me to notice. And I leaned back slightly in the booth, the quiet hum of the cafe continuing around me, the sound of a coffee machine steaming in the background, a chair scraping lightly against the floor somewhere behind me. But none of it distracted me now, because something inside me had shifted again, this time not just awareness, but understanding beginning to take shape. And I turned the page carefully, finding more references, more details, each one confirming that what I was holding was not accidental, not something put together quickly, but part of a larger structure that I had never been shown. And I thought back to the way my husband had always insisted on handling financial matters personally, how he never let anyone else accompany him to the bank, not even Daniel when he offered, how he would come home with neatly organized folders and place them in his study without explanation. And at the time I had accepted it as his way of managing things, his preference for order, but now it felt different. Now it felt like preparation, and I lowered the paper slightly, staring at the table for a moment as the realization settled more firmly into place. Because if this document was accurate, if what it suggested was true, then the assumption that had been made at that dinner, the certainty in Jessica's voice, the quiet agreement in Daniel's silence, all of it had been built on something incomplete, something they did not fully understand, and I felt the faintest hint of something unfamiliar rise within me. Not anger, not yet, but something steadier, something closer to control, and I folded the paper carefully, not rushing, not letting my hands reveal anything beyond what I chose to show, and placed it back into the folder with the same precision my husband used when he handled his documents. And I reached for my coffee again, now lukewarm, taking a small sip as I let my thoughts settle into a single, clear direction, because for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I was not thinking about where I would go next. I was thinking about what I needed to find out, what I needed to confirm, and who I needed to speak to. And the answer came to me quietly, almost naturally. The bank, the place where everything had always been recorded, verified, made real. And I set the cup down, my decision already made before I even stood up, because whatever my husband had arranged, whatever he had prepared, it had not been meant to be overlooked, and I was no longer going to overlook anything. I paid for the coffee in cash, leaving a few extra dollars on the table without thinking too much about it. And as I stepped back out into the night, the air felt different than it had before, not colder, not warmer, just clearer somehow, as if the path ahead had begun to take shape even though I could not yet see all of it. And I walked with purpose now, not quickly, but without hesitation, my steps steady against the sidewalk as I made my way toward the main street where I knew there would be a hotel open at this hour, a place to rest for the night, because I understood that whatever came next required clarity, not exhaustion. And as I moved through the quiet streets, my mind remained focused on what I had read, replaying the phrases, the structure, the intent behind the document. And I began to think not just about the trust itself, but about the man who had created it, about the way my husband had always approached things with quiet precision, never leaving anything unfinished, never relying on chance. And I realized that if he had taken the time to arrange something like this, then he had also taken steps to ensure it could be accessed, verified, and enforced. And that thought grounded me further as I reached the small hotel on the corner, its lobby lights glowing softly through the glass doors. And inside, the clerk barely looked up as I checked in, handing me a key card with a practiced motion. And I took the elevator up to the third floor, the quiet hum filling the space as I stood alone, my reflection faintly visible in the metal doors, composed, steady. Someone I almost did not recognize compared to the woman who had sat at that dinner table earlier that evening. And when I entered the room, I did not turn on the television or unpack anything. I simply placed my purse on the desk, took off my coat, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the silence settle around me once again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt focused, and I reached for the leather folder again, opening it under the soft lamplight, reviewing the document one more time, slower now, tracing each line as if committing it to memory. And I noticed a detail I had overlooked before, a reference to a specific branch location, a familiar one, the same bank my husband had used for years, and beneath it a name, not mine, not Daniel's, but someone else, someone listed as a point of contact. And I studied it carefully, letting the name settle into my mind because I understood its importance immediately. This was not just paperwork. This was a path, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back into my purse with the same care I had seen my husband use so many times before. And I lay back on the bed without turning off the light, staring at the ceiling as the events of the night arranged themselves into something clearer, something structured. And for the first time since everything had begun, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought, not of loss, not of anger, but of certainty, that whatever Daniel and Jessica believed about my position, about my place, about what I had or did not have, was incomplete. And by morning, I intended to begin confirming exactly how incomplete it truly was. Morning arrived quietly, not with any dramatic shift, but with a thin line of light slipping through the edges of the curtains and stretching across the carpet toward the foot of the bed. And I opened my eyes without hesitation, as if I had not truly been asleep, but simply waiting for the next step to begin. And for a moment I lay still, listening to the soft hum of the building around me, distant footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of a door closing somewhere far away. And then I sat up. Slowly, my movements measured, deliberate, because everything I did now felt like it mattered in a way it had not before. And I reached for my purse immediately, not out of fear that something might be gone, but out of certainty that what was inside it had become the most important thing I carried. And I placed the folder on the small desk by the window, opening it once more under the natural light, letting the details reveal themselves more clearly than they had the night before. And I read through the document again, this time not as someone discovering something unexpected, but as someone verifying what she already understood. And the name of the bank branch stood out again, along with the contact listed beneath it. And I repeated that name quietly to myself, committing it fully to memory, because I knew that today would not be about asking questions blindly. It would be about confirming facts, and I stood, smoothing out my coat before putting it on, checking my reflection briefly in the mirror, not to adjust my appearance, but to acknowledge the person looking back at me, steady, composed, not uncertain anymore. And when I stepped out of the room and into the hallway, I did not hesitate. I moved forward with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, yet entirely natural at the same time, and the elevator ride down was silent, just the soft mechanical movement marking each floor as I descended. And when the doors opened into the lobby, I walked straight past the front desk without looking to either side, pushing through the glass doors and into the cool morning air, where the city was just beginning to wake. A few cars on the road, a man unlocking the door to a nearby store, the ordinary beginning of a day that, for me, felt anything but ordinary, and I started toward the bank branch I knew well, the one my husband had trusted for years, the one that now held answers I had never thought to look for. And as I walked, I felt no urgency, no rush, only a steady forward motion, because I understood that whatever I was about to uncover would not disappear if I moved slowly, and that confidence settled into each step I took. And when the building came into view, its familiar sign above the entrance, its glass doors reflecting the street behind me, I paused for just a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because this was the place where things had been decided long before I realized it. And now I was here not as someone being informed, but as someone ready to understand. And I reached for the door, my hand steady, my mind clear, knowing that whatever waited inside was no longer something hidden from me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the soft chime echoing briefly in the quiet lobby of the bank. And for a moment, everything felt almost unchanged. The polished floors, the neutral tones, the faint scent of paper and coffee lingering in the air, as if this place existed outside of the tension that had unfolded the night before. And I walked toward the front desk with steady steps, my purse held close but not tightly, my posture upright in a way that felt natural rather than forced. And the woman behind the counter looked up with a polite, practiced smile, asking how she could help me. And I spoke clearly, calmly, giving my full name, Margaret Whitmore, and mentioning that I needed to speak with someone regarding a trust account associated with my late husband. And I saw the smallest shift in her expression, not alarm, not concern, but recognition, and she nodded, typing something into her computer before asking me to take a seat while she contacted the appropriate person, and I did as she said, moving to a chair near the window, placing my purse on my lap as I waited, not impatient, not anxious, just aware, watching as people moved in and out of the building, their lives continuing in quiet routines that felt distant from mine. And after a few minutes, a man in a dark suit approached, his expression professional but attentive, introducing himself as Mr. Collins. And when he said my name again, this time with a slight emphasis, I understood that he had already reviewed something before coming out to meet me. And he gestured for me to follow him to a private office, and I stood without hesitation, walking beside him down a short hallway into a room with a large desk and 2 chairs facing each other. And once we were seated, he did not begin with small talk. He did not ask unnecessary questions. Instead, he looked at me with a level of focus that felt deliberate and said that he had been expecting me at some point, not today specifically, but eventually. And that statement settled into the space between us with a weight that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. And I reached into my purse, taking out the folded document and placing it on the desk in front of him, sliding it forward without explanation, because I knew he would understand its significance without needing me to say anything. And he unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the page with familiarity rather than surprise. And after a moment, he nodded once, almost to himself, before looking back at me. And in that brief pause, I felt something shift again, not uncertainty, not even curiosity anymore, but clarity, because the way he handled that paper, the way he had already recognized my name, all of it pointed to something far more structured than I had ever been told. And when he finally spoke, his voice measured and precise, he began to explain that my husband had established a comprehensive financial structure well before his passing, one that designated primary control and ownership in a way that could not be altered without my authorization. And I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my mind absorbing each word not as a surprise, but as confirmation, because piece by piece, the version of reality that had been presented to me at that dinner table was beginning to unravel, and in its place something far more solid was taking shape, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to see it clearly. Mr. Collins did not rush through his explanation. He spoke with the kind of precision that comes from repeating the same facts many times. But there was a subtle difference in his tone, a level of attentiveness that made it clear this was not just another routine conversation. And he turned the document slightly, so it faced me, pointing to specific sections as he outlined what my husband had arranged. A trust that held not only financial accounts, but also property ownership, investment, portfolios, and controlling interest in the family home, all structured in a way that placed me as the sole primary beneficiary and decision-maker. And I listened without interrupting, my eyes following the lines he indicated, recognizing now how deliberate every detail had been, how carefully everything had been designed to ensure that control could not be transferred, altered, or assumed by anyone else without my direct involvement. And when he finished explaining the structure, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands, watching me with a measured expression as if waiting for a reaction. But I did not give him one, not because I did not feel anything, but because what I felt was not something that needed to be shown. It was something that needed to be understood fully, and I asked only one question, my voice calm, steady, asking whether anyone else had attempted to access or make changes to these accounts since my husband passed. And for the first time his expression shifted in a way that confirmed more than his words did. A brief pause, almost imperceptible, before he answered that there had been inquiries, requests framed as administrative updates, attempts to review or adjust certain holdings, but none of them had been successful, because the structure required my authorization for any action to be taken. And that answer settled into me with a quiet finality, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to understand, that the confidence displayed at that dinner table had not come from knowledge. It had come from assumption, and assumptions, no matter how certain they appear, do not change facts. And I nodded once, absorbing that information without comment, and Mr. Collins continued, explaining that my husband had anticipated potential complications, that he had instructed the bank to restrict access and maintain confidentiality until I personally initiated contact, which I had now done, and that from this point forward all decisions, all movements, all control rested entirely with me. And as he spoke those words, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me. Not a surge of emotion, not even relief, but a steady, undeniable sense of position, of standing on ground that had always been mine even when I did not realize it. And I looked down at the document once more, then back at him, and for the first time since entering the building I allowed a small, controlled shift in my expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but clarity. And I asked what steps were required to formally activate full control over the accounts and assets, and he responded immediately, outlining the process, the verification, the signatures, all of it straightforward, structured, precise, and I listened carefully, committing each step to memory, because I understood now that this was not just about reclaiming something. It was about establishing something, defining it clearly, without hesitation, without doubt. And when he finished, I did not take time to consider. I simply nodded and said that I was ready to proceed, because whatever they believed about my situation, whatever they had planned based on those beliefs, was about to meet a reality they had not prepared for, and I intended to move forward without hesitation, exactly as my husband had quietly prepared me to do. The process did not take long, but it was thorough, each document placed in front of me with quiet precision as Mr. Collins explained where to sign, where to initial, what each section confirmed, and I listened carefully, not because I doubted him, but because I understood now that every detail mattered. And as I signed my name, Margaret Whitmore, again and again across those pages, I felt something settle into place with each stroke of the pen, not just authority, but recognition, as if I were stepping fully into a role that had always been mine, but had been kept just out of reach until this moment. And when the final document was completed, he gathered the papers neatly, aligning them into a single folder before looking at me with that same measured expression and confirming that everything was now active, fully under my control, and I nodded once, not needing further explanation, because I could already feel the shift, not in the room, not in the bank, but in the quiet certainty of my own position, and I stood, thanking him briefly before turning toward the door, my movements unhurried, composed, as if this had always been the outcome I expected, and when I stepped back into the main lobby, the atmosphere felt different. Though nothing had changed, people still waited in line, tellers still spoke in low voices. The world continued in its usual rhythm, but I was no longer moving through it in the same way, and I walked out of the building into the morning light, the air crisp, the sky clear, and I paused for just a moment on the steps, not to reflect on what had happened, but to consider what came next, and my thoughts did not return to uncertainty. They moved forward, structured, deliberate, because I knew now that the situation at the house was not resolved. It was simply exposed, and as I reached into my purse and took out my phone, I noticed there were still no messages, no calls, no sign that Daniel had considered the absence I had left behind, and that detail, small as it was, confirmed something more clearly than anything else could have, that whatever remained between us was no longer built on understanding, and I slipped the phone back into my purse without unlocking it, without checking anything further, because I did not need confirmation from him to proceed, and instead I turned my attention to what I would do next, not out of impulse, not out of reaction, but with the same quiet control that had carried me through the past few hours, and I began walking, not back toward the hotel, not toward any place that held uncertainty, but toward the direction of the house, not to return as I had been, not to ask for anything, but to step into that space with a clarity they had not anticipated, because for the first time since I had been told to leave, I was not going back as someone who needed permission, I was going back as someone who understood exactly where she stood, and that difference, though invisible to anyone else, was the only thing that mattered. I did not rush as I approached the house, my steps steady along the familiar sidewalk, each crack in the pavement exactly where I remembered it, each tree lining the street unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all, and yet everything had. And when the house came into full view, I slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this place had held decades of my life. Birthdays, quiet mornings, ordinary evenings that once felt permanent, and now it stood there the same. As always, unaware that the balance of what it represented had already changed, and I walked up the driveway without stopping, my gaze level, my posture calm, and when I reached the front door, I did not reach for the handle immediately. I paused just long enough to take in the small details, the potted plant Jessica had placed by the entrance, the new welcome mat that had replaced the one I had chosen years ago, the subtle ways the space had been reshaped without me noticing, and then I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house greeting me, a mixture of polished wood and something faintly floral, and the sound of voices drifted in from the kitchen, low at first, then clearer as I moved further in, and I saw them standing there, Daniel leaning against the counter, Jessica speaking with a casual ease that suggested nothing had unsettled her, and for a brief second they did not notice me, and in that second I observed them the way one observes strangers, without attachment, without expectation, simply seeing what was there. And then Jessica turned, her expression shifting instantly as she saw me, surprise first, then something sharper beneath it, and Daniel followed her gaze, his posture straightening, his face tightening in a way that suggested confusion rather than understanding, and I did not raise my voice, I did not move quickly. I simply stepped fully into the room and placed my purse gently on the edge of the table, my movements controlled, deliberate, and the silence that followed was not heavy. It was precise, like a space waiting to be filled with something that would define it. And Jessica spoke first, her tone edged with something close to irritation, as she asked why I was back, as if the answer should have been obvious, as if my presence itself was an inconvenience. And I looked at her briefly, then at Daniel, not searching for a reaction, not expecting anything from him, just acknowledging his presence before returning my attention to the space around us. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, even, not raised, not forceful, but clear enough that there was no room for misunderstanding. And I said that there had been a misunderstanding the night before, not emotional, not dramatic, simply factual, and I reached into my purse, taking out the folder and placing it on the table, opening it slowly, giving them just enough time to see that this was not a conversation built on assumption, And I did not explain everything at once. I did not rush through the details. I simply stated, with the same steady tone, that the house, the accounts, and everything connected to them were not available for discussion or redistribution without my consent. And I watched as the certainty in Jessica's posture shifted, just slightly at first, then more noticeably as the meaning settled in, and Daniel's expression changed as well, confusion giving way to something closer to realization. And I did not press further. I did not add unnecessary words, because I understood that what mattered was not how much I said, but what had already been established. And I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, not as a gesture of possession, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had always been there. And in that moment the room felt different, not because of what I had done, but because of what they were beginning to understand, that the position they believed I held was never accurate to begin with. Jessica was the first to react, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the calculation behind her silence, her eyes moving quickly between the folder and my face as if searching for a weakness that was no longer there. And she let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but carried none of the ease it was meant to suggest. And she said something about misunderstandings, about paperwork being complicated, about how things could always be discussed as a family, but her voice had already lost the certainty it held the night before, and Daniel remained still beside the counter, his gaze fixed on the table, on the folder, on the space where everything had quietly shifted beyond his control. And I watched them both without interruption, not out of patience, but because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. And after a moment I spoke again, not to explain, not to convince, but to state something simple and final, that there would be no changes made without my decision, no discussions held without my agreement, and no assumptions acted upon without consequence. And my tone remained even, steady, the same as it had been since I walked into the room. Because I understood now that control did not come from raising my voice or asserting dominance. It came from clarity, from knowing exactly where I stood and not allowing that position to be questioned. And the silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier in a way that belonged to them, not to me. And Jessica looked at Daniel as if expecting him to respond, to take control of the situation the way he might have before. But he did not move. He did not speak. And that stillness said more than anything else could have. And I reached for my purse again, closing the folder with quiet precision and placing it back inside, not rushing, not lingering, simply completing the action as naturally as I had done everything else that morning. And I took a step back from the table, my gaze moving once more across the room, not with attachment, not with regret, but with recognition, because this space, for all the years it held, no longer defined me in the way it once had. And I turned toward the door without waiting for a response, without asking for acknowledgement, because I no longer needed either. And as I reached the entryway I paused briefly, not to look back at them, but to take in the quiet of the house one last time, the same quiet that had once felt like comfort. And I understood then that what had changed was not the house, not even them, but my place within it. And that place was no longer something they could assign or remove. And I opened the door and stepped outside into the clear daylight. The air steady, the world moving forward without hesitation, and as I walked down the driveway, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was stepping fully into something that had been waiting for me all along, something defined not by their approval or rejection, but by my own understanding. And for the first time in a long time, there was no uncertainty in that direction, only a quiet, unwavering sense of control that did not need to be announced to be real.